And he said unto them, Why are ye so fearful? How is it that ye have no faith? And they feared exceedingly, and said one to another, What manner of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? And they came over unto the other side of the sea, unto the country of the Gadarenes. And when he was come out of the ship, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who had his dwelling among the tombs. And no man could bind him, no, not with chains, because that he had been often bound with fetters and chains, and the chains had been plucked asunder by him, and the fetters broken in pieces. Neither could any man tame him. And always, night and day, he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying and cutting himself with stones. But when he saw Jesus afar off, he ran and worshipped him, and cried with a loud voice and said, What have I to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of the Most High God? I adjure thee by God that thou torment me not. For he had said unto him, Come out of the man, thou unclean spirit. And he asked him, What is thy name? And he answered, saying, My name is Legion, for we are many. And he besought him much that he would not send them away out of the country. Now there was nigh unto the mountain a great herd of swine feeding, and all the devils besought him, saying, Send us into the swine, that we may enter into them. And forthwith Jesus gave them leave. And the unclean spirits went out and entered into the swine, and the herd ran violently down a steep place into the sea. They were about 2,000, and were choked in the sea. And they that fed the swine fled, and told it in the city and in the country. And they went out to see what it was that was done. And they come to Jesus, and seeing him that was possessed with the devil, and had the legion sitting and clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And they saw it told them how it befell him that was possessed with the devil, and also concerning the swine. And they began to pray him to depart out of their coasts. And when he was come into the ship, he that had been possessed with the devil prayed him that he might be with him. Howbeit Jesus suffered him not, but saith unto him, Go home to thy friends, and tell them how great things the Lord hath done for thee, and hath had compassion on thee. And he departed, and began to publish in Decapolis how great things Jesus had done for him, and all men did marvel. And when Jesus passed over again by the ship unto the other side, much people gathered unto him, and he was nigh unto the sea. And behold, there cometh one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name. And when he saw him, he fell at his feet and besought him greatly, saying, My little daughter lieth at the point of death. I pray thee, come and lay thy hands on her, for she may be healed, and she shall live. And Jesus went with him, and much people followed him and thronged him. And a certain woman, which had an issue of blood 12 years, and had suffered many things of many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was nothing bettered, but rather grew worse. When she had heard of Jesus, came in the press behind, and touched his garment. For she said, If I may touch but his clothes, I shall be whole. And straightway the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of that plague. And Jesus, immediately knowing that in himself that virtue had gone out of him, turned him about in the press and said, Who touched my clothes? And his disciples said unto him, Thou seest the multitude thronging thee, and sayest thou, Who touched me? And he looked round about to see her that had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what was done in her, came and fell down before him, and told him all the truth. And he said unto her, Daughter, thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace, and be whole of thy plague. While he yet spake, there came from the ruler of the synagogue's house certain which said, Thy daughter is dead. Why troublest thou the master any further? As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he saith unto the ruler of the synagogue, Be not afraid, only believe. And he suffered no man to follow him, save Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And he cometh into the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and seeth the tumult, and them that wept and wailed greatly. And when he was come in, he saith unto them, Why make ye this ado and weep? The damsel is not dead, but sleepeth. And they laughed him to scorn. But when he had put them all out, he taketh the father and the mother of the damsel, and them that were with him, and entered in where the damsel was lying. And he took the damsel by the hand, and said unto her, Talitha cumi, which is being interpreted, Damsel, I say unto thee, arise. And straightway the damsel arose, and walked, for she was of 12 years of age. And they were astonished with great astonishment. And he charged them straitly that no man should know it, and commanded that something be given her to eat. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, thank you very much, Joseph. That was a very good reading. Well done. Love it how much effort you all you lectors put into doing this for us. I've tried doing it before we got the lectors to take it over for us, and it took as long for me to try to figure out how to read it where it would be meaningful as it did to actually prepare the sermon. So it's like cut my preparation time in half, you guys doing that. So you're doing a really useful and meaningful service for us especially, and I think for the church. So we thank you very much for that. Okay, we'll get right into the text here. Obviously, we are not going to cover all the details. We had a very extensive section of it, and there are a lot of different points that could and should be made from this text. Partially, they've been made many, many times. So any one story or any one little part of that text, you can probably find dozens of sermons of evangelical fundamentalist pastors like us who have preached them, and good sermons, and get a lot of information about them. And so I'm not going to really go into a lot of the details in this, and it's not because I don't think they're meaningful. I think they're very important and very meaningful, but we're trying to do something different with Mark as we go through it. We're trying to look at it more of an overview type of an approach, more of a panoramic perspective, if you will. And so we're going to keep that perspective. We're going to look at how all of these 4 different stories tie into each other and what Mark might be trying to communicate by having selected them very carefully, very intentionally, and edited them very extensively to put them together into a group of things that really have some things together. And while we're not going to necessarily deal with it at great length, but you can see some of the similarities between these, right? For instance, fear is a recurring theme in all of them. The storm comes up, and the disciples fear, and so they wake up Jesus and say, don't you care for us that we perish? And then he calms the sea. You have the Gadarenes that come out and find the demoniac who's been healed. And when they see all that's happened and this incredible miracle, that you realize this man, this demoniac, had been tormenting, had been terrorizing their entire villages for a long time. They knew who he was, and you couldn't go in those areas because you didn't know this man had uncommon strength and violence, and so he was a terrorist of the town, and everyone knew it, and they come out and they find him, and he's clothed, and he's in his right mind, and he's peaceful, and you think, well, how would you react to that? Well, they were very afraid. They reacted with a great deal of fear. They were very afraid at what they saw. They could not explain that. To them, that was more fearful than having some insane, crazy person ripping chains off their body and running around naked and terrorizing the town. That was actually more fearful because they could not explain what had happened. And when people can't explain something, that's actually worse than something that's fearful that you can explain. This is why we're scared of the dark, right? And if you say you're not, that's not true. We're all afraid of the dark, right? Everybody is. And that's why there's very few horror films that are set in the light of day, because, it just isn't nearly as scary usually unless it's in the dark. Yeah, we're all afraid of the dark because we don't know what might be there, right? It's what could be there that is even more frightening. And so we have the fear there. You have the fear that you have when Jairus' daughter and that whole thing that comes up. And then you have the fear of what happens with the woman who's healed. And she reaches out and touches Jesus' garment, and he says, "Who did this?" And he turns around, and it says, "And she was afraid." So we see that just in that, there's these common elements that run through these stories. We're not going to deal with the fear one. I just wanted to point that out to show that there's more than one unifying element that we find here, just like in all the others that we've seen so far. These stories could have appeared in a number of different places. I mean, some of them are tied chronologically together, like Joseph pointed out, where you have, Jesus has taught in parables, and then it says, and on the same day this happened. So that's chronologically tied. But there's a lot of these stories of the pericopes, the vignettes of Mark, that are not tied chronologically. They could be in other places. And as we saw 2 weeks ago, we talked about it, Matthew puts many of these stories in different locations. And not just proportionally in the book, but he changes the order a little bit. And so we find that these stories don't always appear in the exact same chronological order because they're making different points with them. So there's reasons for that. And so when we look at these stories, we say, why did Mark put these in this order? Why do they appear in the book at this time? What do they mean there? And that's what we're trying to get at. And that answer is a lot more complicated than what I could give you in 30 minutes or an hour. It's more complicated than I probably even understand myself or probably anybody. The Gospels are one of those type of books that have just layers and layers in them. And that's not abnormal. All good literature is this way. So I don't know how many of you are readers. You like to read, you love to read. If you're a reader, you find books that are well written. And when you find a book that's well written, it's a book that you can read multiple times and get something different out of it every time. And it's not just the Bible that's that way. I read a lot. I've always read a lot. And there are books that I can read many, many, many times. I can just read the same book many times. Not just because I relive the enjoyment of the first time, but because as I read it, I start realizing how the author has woven this story, woven details in. They don't telegraph them out. They're woven in. And when you read it the second or third time, you're like, I didn't notice that. But that ties into how the story develops later on. And you start realizing that this is a very meaningful and deep book. And there's not a lot of books, relatively speaking, like that. But when you find books like that, well, they're very, very enjoyable when you start finding them. That's how the Gospels are written. There is a reason why the Gospels are some of the most read books in human history, if not the most read books in human history. This isn't just about religious superstition. We have to read it because it's the Word of God, even though it's boring as all get out. That is not why. That would not account for that. There are a lot of other holy books with religions that are of the same basic number of believers, and they aren't even close to having a book as well read as the Bible is well read, as much commented on as the Bible is commented on. Not even close. There's a reason why the Gospels are so read so much, so well read, and that is because they're so well written. They're very well written books. And if you read them, and you don't have to think of them as the Word of God, you read them and you think, how is this written? How is this story composed? How is it put together? And you start realizing these people really put a lot of thought and a lot of time into composing these stories and putting them together. Very, very interesting. And they're trying to tell a large story. Mark isn't about all the little stories. It is about one big story. And that's what we're trying to get at as we go through Mark. So what I want to look at today in these stories, and this is just one of the ways we could look at them. Again, there are many, many layers here, and I'm probably not going to pick the one that you would have liked me to pick. I'm sorry about that. I picked the one that I thought was maybe not as often dealt with, maybe a little bit out of the way, and hopefully you can see some purpose there in what Mark is trying to do. But there is an element, a common element that we have in all of these stories. And the common element are the obstructions that Jesus dealt with in his ministry as he went about to help people. Obstructions, not necessarily enemies, right? Because we've dealt with that. And you have those who were intentionally and adamantly antagonistic to Christ. So, like if you ask most Christians that, they'll be able to rattle right off the top of their head, well, the Pharisees, right? The Sadducees, the Herodians, correct. Jesus dealt with actual enemies, the demons. He dealt with these actual antagonistic enemies throughout his ministry, but we're not talking about that today. We're talking about just those who either purposefully or inadvertently got in the way of what Jesus was trying to accomplish. Many times, it's not that they so much wanted to be in the way, but they were in the way. And so every one of these stories that we read in this passage, that is a common theme. You have Jesus, you have who he's trying to minister to, and then you have something that's just a stumbling block. It's something he has to navigate around. For instance, you have the woman. You'll start with an easy one. You have the woman, and has this illness that she's had for a long time. It says it's a bleeding that won't stop. We don't know if it's most likely is a menstrual bleeding, but it's just constant, never ends. So it's extremely debilitating, as most of the ladies in the church would be able to identify with. It's a very serious and very debilitating and very life-altering problem. It's also a religious problem because it limits you from being able to have any part in the temple, because the law of Moses did not allow a woman in that situation to even come into the temple. So it's a religious problem. It's obviously a social problem. There are a lot of problems here. This woman is very afflicted and has been for a very long time. In fact, we're told in a different account that she'd been to many doctors, and so it's also a financial burden. She's basically been drained of all her financial resources, so there's no hope. So she has a psychological problem in that she's now found herself in a hopeless position. And here's someone who can help her. And yet here's the crowd, what Mark calls, or what the translation of Mark calls, the press, which, is kind of fitting, right? The paparazzi, right? That's who's there. And they're not thinking, hey, let's keep that woman out of here. They're not intentionally like, hey, stomp on her hand as she reaches out there. Keep her out of here. We don't want her here. It isn't intentional, but that's the problem. They have no intention of helping her either. And they're not really there for any real reason for themselves. They're just there. They're just in the way. Right? This is the throng. The throng, they're just in the way. They're there to see what can be seen. They're curious. Jesus has done miracles, and they want to see some. They're not interested in any for themselves. That's what the apostles observed. Right? Jesus says, hey, somebody touched me. And the apostles are like, you're being thronged by this seething multitude of people. Right? You figure maybe a couple hundred, maybe more. It wasn't unlikely for Jesus to have 5,000 or 10,000 people throng him at one time. And so you just imagine this mob of people, and they're just seething and bubbling around him, and they're pushing, and they're all trying to get a piece of him. They're all trying to get their hand on him. They're trying to get his attention. You can just imagine what this would be like. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of all that, Jesus stops and says, somebody touched me. And the disciples point out how absurd that sounds. What do you mean, Yeah, everybody's touching you. And he says, no, not like that. Not like this. Somebody reached out and touched me in a way that no one else is doing it. So all those people that were there, they were not there for the purpose or the reason that she was there for. She was there for a different reason. But they were in her way. What we find from the throng of people is that they wanted something from Jesus, in a sense, right? They wanted entertainment maybe. They had some interest in some things. They were curious and they wanted that satisfied. But they had no commitment to Jesus. And this, I think we can look at this and draw for ourselves some understanding as to what a true relationship is. So what Jesus pictures, what he portrays with this woman is that she had opened a path of relationship with him. There was a connection, is how we would say it nowadays. Physically, literally, as you would say today, right? Also, there was literally a connection between her and Jesus that he and her both felt immediately. Now she actually was physically healed. I don't want to minimize that. Don't think I'm just making it all metaphorical. There was a real connection. He felt it. Something went out of him. She felt it. Something came into her. She was physically, miraculously healed. But what Mark is also demonstrating is that when we come into contact with Jesus in the proper way, we establish a connection with him. And it's real, just as real as hers was. Even though the results might be in a different type, it's just as real. And what was it that established the connection between her and Jesus that the throng of people, the mob of people, did not share? Even though they have more of a piece of him than she did, right? They're grabbing his arms, they're holding his hands. If you've ever seen a famous person walk through a mob, you can just imagine then what it was Jesus walking through. They're all grabbing at him, they're all pressing their hand against his hand, they're all trying to hug him, give him their babies. This is the type of environment it is, and yet none of them have a connection to Jesus. And that partly is because they all wanted something from him exclusively. That's all. They had no commitment to him. No commitment to him. This is the difference between a real relationship and a selfish relationship. And not just with Christ, even though all true relationships, I think, must start with God and work their way out and down. But even within friends, family members, spouses, siblings, there's a difference between real relationships and self-serving ones. A real relationship is not one that perseveres even in hardship. Sometimes we think about it that way, that a real marriage is one that even if things get rough, it perseveres. No, that's actually not a good definition. A real relationship is one that exists precisely for the hardship. Not for your hardship. See, that would be self-serving. Like, I'm going to get married so that when I am no longer able to change my own diaper, I have someone who can do it for me. No. Love you. No, that would be self-serving. A real relationship based on self-sacrificing love is to say, I want a relationship so that when you have hardship, you have someone to help you carry that. It is a committed thing. And with Jesus, we see immediately the commitment he offers, right? She's healed because she makes a connection with him. But then we see her commitment start to show forth that when Jesus turns around and says, who does it? Even though she's scared out of her mind, and you got to realize, you say, why would she be so scared? Well, there's a number of reasons. But one is because what she did was essentially illegal. If you go back and study the law of Moses, what she did was very illegal. He could have brought her up to the Sanhedrin on charges. This was a serious offense. You say, where is her commitment? Her commitment is to say, when Jesus says, I want to know who touched me, even though she's scared out of her mind, this connection with Christ was so real and created such a commitment in her heart that she committed herself, in a sense, into his hands, gave herself, her own life into his hands by saying, it was me. And showed a tremendous trust in him. You only show that kind of trust, you only live that kind of trust when you have a really self-sacrificing, loving, committed relationship. So that's one of them. The one before that, we have the demoniac. Jesus leaves and goes across the Sea of Galilee into the villages of the Gadarenes. And when he gets there, out comes this demoniac, out comes this man possessed with demons, many demons, right? And he's naked, and he's got chains attached to him where he's broken them apart, and he's cutting himself, and he's all scarred up from years of self-abuse. And nobody can get near that area. The whole area is dead because you can't do anything there because there's this guy running around screeching and screaming and attacking everybody. And Jesus gets there and he has a conversation with those demons. And the demons ask him for mercy. And if you ever want to understand just how merciful God is, consider that he showed mercy to these demons. And there is just no reason for this. There is no logical reason for this. You can argue whenever he shows mercy to a human being, no matter how opposed that person is to the gospel, you can always say, well, there's always hope, right? And so you show mercy because there's hope. But there's no hope for the demons. And what this illustrates is not two forms of mercy. It illustrates just how deep mercy really is and how we don't understand it. See, when we say, well, God is merciful to these people who are extremely antagonistic to the gospel because, see, this is where we go wrong, because there's always hope. That's why he did it. We are not understanding mercy then. God shows mercy for one reason, for the glory of his grace. So that his grace, his mercifulness will be acknowledged and admired and be given all throughout all of creation. And Jesus exemplifies this intent when he does this with the demons. So they ask for mercy. They say, don't just throw us back into the pit. Let us go into these swine. And Jesus says, all right, do that. Go into the swine. So they possess the pigs. Apparently there's a lot of demons in there. They possess the pigs, and the pigs all run down crazy. They didn't have any clothes to take off, so they just ran right down in and drowned themselves, right? And all the people come out eventually, and they see what's happening. But here you have the merchants. These are the people who have now lost their whole herd of swine. And the merchants have always been an obstacle to the gospel. I bring this up partly because it's there, but we as Americans, and probably most of you in here are like conservative, lean libertarian, probably or possibly, and laissez-faire free marketers, and you just think that, Hollywood vilifying big corporations is terrible, and you think you need to somehow defend big business and big corporations. I want to caution you, the Bible is not pro-big business. I'm not sure what it is about Americans that think they need to defend tax breaks for billionaires. I know you may have some economical argument for it, but biblically speaking, now get me off talking my libertarian mindset and we'll have a little bit different conversation, but biblically speaking, The Bible's very clear about this. There's some real problems with big money. Now, poverty's not the solution. And I'm not here trying to tell you that we should all give away everything and go live in the hills, right? Take off all our clothes and live like a demoniac. That's not the solution. Jesus healed that also. But this idea that somehow we need to canonize big business and big money, and it's very much an American mindset, especially conservative American mindset, that isn't the scriptural place. The Christian church is not the place to be defending free markets. The Christian church and the Christian meetings not the place to be defending tax breaks. That is not what we're here for. The worst thing in the world is not a 28% tax rate. When Jesus was approached on tax issues, he said, whose picture is on that money? We'll give it back to him. That was Jesus' answer to taxation without representation. He said, give it back to him then. So we need to be very, very careful. Why is that? James makes this point with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. He says, you have despised the poor. He could very well be writing this to the modern day American conservative. You have despised the poor. Do not rich men oppress you and draw you before judgment seats? Don't they sue you into submission, he's saying? Do not they blaspheme the worthy name by which ye are called? So why are you treating them with such special treatment? He says what happens is you have your meeting, and when a very poor person comes in, you despise them. You think, well, we don't do that. We believe in meritocracy. We believe that if they didn't want to be poor, they wouldn't be. So they're poor because they want to be. We don't despise them. We just think they're lazy. And a rich person comes into the church, he says, and you treat them specially. Sit in a special place. Sit next to me. Be my friend. You need to be very cautious with that. Because it's these kind of people who saw their livelihood. When I'm talking about you that are treating them poorly or bad, too well or unfairly. I'm talking about the merchants. Throughout the New Testament, they consistently are either enemies of the gospel or they're at least in the way of the gospel, and there's not very many exceptions. Now, it doesn't have to be that way, and many of the most devout and holy people in the Scriptures were very wealthy. This is not a condemnation of wealth or of wealthy people. But the New Testament is very clear that, by and large, wealthy people have stood in the way of the gospel. If nothing else, they have stood in their own way. Jesus said it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle than a rich person to enter into the kingdom of God. So even if they don't stand in anyone else's way, they often stand in their own way. So we as Christians and Americans, and probably many of you are conservatives, and that's fine. I'm not being political here at all. I just am observing most Southern American Christians tend to be conservative, and they tend to have a certain view about wealth, and it's not necessarily biblically founded. And we need to be cautious with that. Cautious with that. James tells the rich that they should go and weep and howl for the miseries that are going to come upon them. Because why? Because they stand in the way of things. They obstruct the gospel. They obstruct Jesus. And throughout their ministry and the apostles' ministry, you find the same thing. Who was it that caused the uproar that put an end to Paul's ministry in that area of Ephesus? The wealthy merchants that saw that the gospel was putting an end to their profits. Now, this isn't about hating the wealthy either. This is about going back to what James taught us, that we should not be given preferential treatment to the wealthy, and we should not be giving preferential treatment to the concept of wealth, and we shouldn't be mixing libertarian and conservative politics or liberal politics into the gospel. The gospel presents an entirely new creation, like we talked about 2 weeks ago. An entirely new creation that has nothing to do with being conservative or liberal. Now, there are elements of all political philosophies that are abhorrent, and they should be spoken against by Christians. Abortion is abhorrent. But that is not a political statement. We need to be very careful that we are not giving preferential treatment, and even in our own minds, to ideologies and people that espouse them that have consistently and historically stood in the way of the gospel. Because they obstruct the gospel. Now you could say, well, sounds to me like you're defending the liberals. I am not. I just think that they get preached about enough. And unless any of you want to be like that woman with great fear, raise your hand and say, I'm a liberal. Then I'm probably not speaking to any. So, all right. Let's look at the last one, and then we'll look at the first one. And with that, the last one, you have Jesus going to heal Jairus' daughter, right? And that takes place surrounding the woman who we already talked about, who had the crowd getting in her way. So around that is Jesus going to heal Jairus' daughter. And when he gets there to heal her, she's already died. And Jesus comes in, and we talked about this a couple months ago. We actually went through this text before. But Jesus comes in, she's died, and there's all these mourners. Now these are, like we talked about back when we dealt with it, these are professional mourners. You would hire them to wail, right? So that your funeral would be appropriate. And so you hire these people, and they come in, and I pointed out last time we talked about this text, that's actually making a comeback. There's a little cottage industry in America today of professional mourners. Now, they don't do it the way you might be envisioning, right? Like, ah! And then they go back to the green room and refresh themselves, and then come back out and do it again. That's not exactly what they do. They walk around the wake, and they make conversation with all the actual mourners and try to console them, and they know things about the deceased, and they talk to them like they're old friends with the deceased, and that way the people feel like they're being consoled, and the actual mourners don't have to take upon themselves that duty, right? But they're professional mourners. They're there for a paycheck. Well, that's what's happening here. He's walked into Jairus' house. You have all these people. They're wailing and crying. Oh, oh. And Jesus says, stop that. She's not dead. She's just sleeping. And how do we know they're professionals? Because he immediately flipped the switch, and now they're laughing. I mean, it's like the waterworks just click, turn off, and now it's mocking. Ah, ha, 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 ah, ha, ha, ha. Why? Well, because they're the pros. Who knows more about death than someone who goes to at least a funeral a day? They know when the person dies. Their paycheck is contingent on knowing when that person expires, so they can break into the real wailing, right? I mean, you got the little the shoulder jerk going, right? If you're I assume I'm not a professional at this. I'm not good at mourning, even when I ought to be mourning, right? So I assume they got the little going. But when you hear the death rattle, they hear it, and then it's like, right? You pull out the wambulance, right out. Turn on the sirens, away it goes. Who's going to know more about death than them? That's their position. They're the professionals. They're the experts. We got them all around us today. Christians come out and make claims about reality, and everyone laughs. Ah, ha, 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 ha. You idiots, you don't know anything. We're the professionals. We're the scientists. Trust the science. Christians, for the last 100 years, have been saying that if you continue what we call a moral decline, you're going to end up in a society, in a culture, that believes that there is no such thing as absolute objective reality. They laughed. They laughed. They laughed. And now we ask them, what's a man? What's a woman? What's a cat? Who knows? It's whatever the cat thinks a cat is. The Christians were so funny. No, we were dead right. Dead right. We said that if you continue to devalue life, you're going to end up in a society, a culture of death. And we're right. But they make you feel stupid. And you let yourself, and we let ourselves feel stupid. And we don't want to be unsophisticated. I went to the dentist recently, just a while back, and got teeth cleaning, which is a fabulous experience. You should do that. Everyone should do that. It's great. I didn't know how great that was. Anyways, I went there, right? And the hygienist is a Christian, very sweet lady, and she's telling me about her visions she's had. And how she had this vision about this church and that she needs to walk around the parking lot of the church like Jericho and pray for that church. She's telling me all this, and I'm thinking, this is very interesting. Now, the old me would have been mocking. I'm not mocking. I want to be very clear. Not at all. Maybe she didn't have visions. I'm not convinced of that yet doctrinally. But I'll tell you one thing that I was very impressed with. How many of us are willing to state something like that to someone they don't know in their professional environment, in an open office? This wasn't a closed room. All the other professionals in that office could hear her, without any concern that you look like a rube, that you look unsophisticated, unscientific, out of touch. I was very impressed. You say, well, I don't believe in visions. Okay. But are you willing to talk about anything in public where you might be ridiculed? Are you willing to do like Jesus, to walk in and tell all the professionals, she's not dead, she's just sleeping? Boy, they thought that was hilarious. They mocked him to scorn. They didn't just snicker over in the corner. They mocked him until everyone there was embarrassed for him. The pros, the professionals, the experts are many times in the way. And too often we're doing with them like we do for the wealthy. We're trying to become one of them. We're trying to defend them. You don't need to defend anyone with $1 billion in the bank at all. They have lobbies. You do not need to fight for their tax breaks, and you don't need to defend anybody with a PhD. If they have a PhD and they can't defend themselves, then you certainly aren't going to help. You don't need to defend the science. You need to stand up for what you as a Christian know is true because of your relationship with Jesus Christ. And we need to quit being concerned and worried if we look unsophisticated when we do it. One last thing, the first one, the faithful. We saw the merchants, we saw the throng or the mob, and we saw the pros. But we start off with the whole thing with the faithful, the disciples, getting in their own way, with their own fears, doubts, and faithlessness, their own forgetfulness. Too often, we are the ones getting in the way, not just our own way, sadly. That would be bad enough, but we get in the way of others. There's a song by Casting Crowns, I really like it. It has a verse that is very apropos. Jesus, and you know I'm not going to sing. I know some of you are just waiting for that to happen. That's not going to happen. Jesus, friend of sinners, the truth becomes so hard to see. The world is on their way to you, to Jesus, but they're tripping over me. In all of these cases, we really come back to this one in some ways. Are you the one that's obstructing, getting in the way? We think nobody wants to get saved anymore. And that may be true to some extent. I don't know. I know it's probably also true to some extent that they're climbing as hard as they can climb, and a lot of Christians like us are hauling them down in dead weight. And if you think I'm talking about some other church, I'm not. I'm talking about me, and I'm talking about maybe you. You think, well, you know, they're just in the boat and they're scared but we see this attitude they have throughout the ministry. The Gospels, they make it clear they testify to themselves of this. Wanting to call down fire from heaven and burn up people because they didn't agree right away. They didn't believe right away. When the little children wanted to come to Jesus, pushing them away. We don't want you. The blind beggar, shut up. We're trying to accomplish, we're trying to heal people here, and you're making noise. Shh. We're looking for people that need help, and you just keep yelling. Help me, help me. Shut up. We're looking for people that need help. We need to look at all of these, and we need to look at ourselves, because it doesn't do any good to look at these and look outward. We need to look at these and look at ourselves and make sure we're not obstructing the gospel. It's not good enough to be neutral. There is no neutral. You are either furthering the gospel with your life, with your words, with your boldness, your testimony, or you're obstructing it. I am either furthering the gospel or I am obstructing it. And it doesn't have to even be antagonistic or intentional. In fact, the worst type of obstruction is the unintentional, the uncaring. You don't even care one way or the other. You're just a big, useless log laying in the path. Don't be that. Let's close in prayer. Dear Father, we're thankful for your word, even when it stings, even when it's not exactly what we would hope, that it speaks to us in ways that we don't necessarily appreciate, but we still are thankful because we want to hear a word from you that doesn't sound like it's in our own voice, confirming our own thoughts, echoing back our own opinions. Speak to us in your mind, in your word, in your opinions, and heal us of the sting, heal us of the wound, bind us up with your love and your mercy and your kindness and your goodness. Help us, Lord, to be on your side, committed 100% in the relationship, connected to you. We want to share your suffering, not just share our sufferings with you. Give us that mind, give us that heart that was in Christ Jesus, and in his name we pray. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you next week.